Namo Buddhaya. Buddha Dharma TV is dedicated to accommodating peace-loving individuals with the compassionate, serene, and rational teachings of the Buddha. Our programming includes Buddhist sermons on diverse topics, discussions, chanting, Buddhist Jataka tales, music, dramas, glimpses of monasteries, and views of all Buddhist holy sites. Guided meditation techniques will be conducted by Buddhist monks, nuns, and lay teachers representing the Mahayana, Theravada, Vajrayana, and Zen traditions. Our schedule lined up comprises 4 hours of daily programs every weekend for the initial 3 months. Following this period, we will transition to 6 hours of daily live programs. We kindly invite you to make the most of this opportunity, enrich your understanding of the Buddha Dharma, and apply these noble teachings to a daily life. May you all be well and happy.
Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma Itipiso bhagava araham samma sambuddho vichacharana sampanno sugato lokavidu anuttaro purisa dhamma sarati sattha deva manussanam buddho bhagavati Swakato bhagavata dhammo sanditthiko akaliko ehi passiko opanayiko pacchattam veditabbo vinyuhiti supatipanno bhagavato sāvaka sangho ujupatipanno bhagavato sāvaka sangho nyāya patipanno bhagavato sāvaka sangho sāmīti patipanno bhagavato sāvaka sangho yadidam cattāri purisa yugāni aṭṭha purisa pukkala Esa bhagavato sāvaka sangho ahuniyo pahuniyo dakkhineyo anjali karaniyo anuttaram punyam kirtam lokasvati etena sacca vajjena sottite hotu sabbada etena sacca vajjena sottite hotu sabbada etena sacca vajjena sottite hotu sabbada
Bahum sahasnsa mabhinim mi ගිරිමේඛලං උදිත ඝෝර සසේන මාරං දානාදී ධම්ම විදිනා ජිතවා මුනින්දෝ තං තේජසා භවතු තේ ජය මංගලානි මාරාතිරේක මාභියුන් ජිත සබ්බ රත්තිං ඝෝරං පනා ලවක මක්ඛ මාතන්ධ යක්ඛං khන්ති සුදන්ත ජිතවා මුනින්දෝ තං තේජසා භවතු තේ ජය මංගලානි නාලාගිරින් ගජවරං අතිමත්ත භූතං දාවග්ගිචක්ක මසනීව සුදාරුණන්තං මිත්තම් බුසේක විදිනා ජිතවා මුනින්දෝ තං තේජසා භවතු තේ ජය මංගලානි
Okay, so welcome to this class on, I call it the Introduction to Buddhism. And so why are we having this Introduction to Buddhism? Okay, I've been living here at this monastery since 2007, and I've been giving regularly on Saturdays a class on the suttas, on the Buddha's discourses. And the class has continued now for about 10, 11 years. And yet it struck me that we don't have a course that provides people with a foothold in Buddhism, with an introduction to Buddhism. And so I decided to start this very concise class of 6 sessions to provide an introduction or a foothold into Buddhism. And now when I use the word Buddhism, but actually Buddhism is a very vast phenomena, including many different schools, many different forms of belief, doctrines, worship, practices. But what I'm going to be focusing on is not Buddhism in its entirety, but rather what I would call the core or essential teachings of the Buddha. And the source that we rely on for the fundamental teachings of the Buddha is a set of texts that are called the Nikayas. Yeah, the word Nikaya means a collection, and these are collections of suttas. The word sutta is a discourse of the Buddha. And so the discourses of the Buddha were collected very shortly after his passing away, and collected and then incorporated into these collections called Nikayas. And there have been different transmissions of these early Buddhist discourses in different countries, in different languages. But fortunately, we have a version of the early Buddhist discourses preserved in a language which would be very close to the language that the Buddha himself spoke. Probably, as most of you would know, the Buddha lived and taught in northern India, somewhere around the 5th century BC. Scholars are divided about the exact years of his life, but it would be roughly from, say, 500 BC to 420 BC. And so the Buddha traveled over a large extent of northern India and probably used several of the dialects that were current during that period. We don't know exactly what kind of language the Buddha would have used, but it would have been a North Indian language, or several languages or dialects, which would have been derived from Vedic Sanskrit. That's the early form of Sanskrit. But as Sanskrit evolved, Vedic Sanskrit, it became incorporated into colloquial languages. And so the Buddha would have spoken these colloquial languages, and his discourses are now preserved in a language which is related to those North Indian languages, and that language is called Pali, P-A-L-I. Yeah, there are counterparts to these discourses preserved in Pali that had been transmitted to China during the early centuries when Buddhism moved from India to China and translated into Chinese. Later in India, the discourses were translated into the literary form of Sanskrit. Some have been preserved in Tibetan translation. And so we can compare these different versions of the discourses, and what we find, even though there are some differences in formulation and organization, but there's an astonishing amount of agreement among the different versions of these discourses. And so scholars have with a fair degree of certainty, have come to the conclusion that these discourses come as close as we can come to the actual discourses of the Buddha. The Buddha himself didn't write anything down, and in fact, writing was not used for religious texts in India during that period. But the way the teachings were transmitted was through oral discourse, the Buddha speaking, and his disciples having listened to the discourse, would memorize the teachings. How is such feats of memory possible? One thing that I've noticed, I lived in Sri Lanka for many years, and what I've noticed is that growing up in a literate culture in which we depend upon written materials, books, and writing, decreases our capacity for memorization. And I've seen in Sri Lanka simple village people who are not dependent, they might be barely literate, but they can remember things with much greater detail and precision than I can remember with all of my experience in study and writing. And so the Buddha's disciples would have listened to the discourses, and they were probably organized into teams with the responsibility for remembering the discourses and then teaching them to their own students. And in this way, the teachings had been passed on from one generation of monks to the next generation. And shortly after the Buddha passed away, his foremost disciples met. It's said that 3 months or 6 months after his passing away, they met in a kind of conference, a large conference, and they compiled the discourses of the Buddha and arranged them into these collections. Okay, so I'm explaining this just to make clear what I'm going to be covering in this course. So I'm not trying to cover Buddhism in its entirety, but the fundamental teachings of the Buddha, the teachings that in greatest likelihood come from the Buddha himself. And these teachings are derived from these collections called Nikayas. And the individual discourses and the Nikayas are the suttas. Okay, so first, the word Buddha. The word Buddha is not a proper name, but it is an honorific title. And it's the title which is given to the historical founder of Buddhism. And the word Buddha comes from the verb bujati, which means to understand, to comprehend. And so the Buddha is one who has understood, who is comprehended, I would say, like the deepest truths of existence, and who makes known the path or way that leads to greater human happiness, inner peace, and ultimate liberation. And what the Buddha teaches is called, in the Pali language, is called the Dhamma. Yeah, the word Dhamma in its sort of broadest meaning, I would define as the fundamental principle of truth and goodness. It's a principle in which, you could say, in which the nature of reality and the nature of good, of goodness, are merged. And so a person becomes a Buddha, a fully enlightened one, by realizing, by understanding, by comprehending the Dhamma in its totality, and then declaring the Dhamma to the world. And so you could say that the Dhamma is the fundamental truth about human life, human existence, or more broadly, the fundamental truth about all existence, the fundamental truth about reality, the real nature of things. And so the task or function of the Buddha what makes him the enlightened one is that he has realized, awakened to, comprehended the Dhamma in its totality, and then he teaches the Dhamma to the world. So the Buddha is not a savior in any way, somebody that one relies upon to do the work of salvation for oneself, but rather his role is to be that of a teacher. He is the one who teaches the Dhamma to reveal to us, to expose to us the fundamental nature of the reality of our own lives. So he teaches the fundamental reality of our own life and the path to be followed to achieve the ultimate good of human existence. And there's a certain passage that we come across often in the suttas, in the discourses, which in a way indicates which indicates the Buddha's role as a teacher. This is a stock passage when somebody has come to the Buddha and asked for a clarification of a particular point, and then the Buddha gives this person a discourse. And at the end of the discourse, the way the person expresses appreciation, he starts off by saying, "Excellent, excellent." And then he calls the Buddha the Blessed One. So he says, "The Blessed One has made the Dhamma clear in many ways, as though he were turning upright what had been overthrown, revealing what was hidden, showing the way to one who is lost, or holding up a lamp in the darkness so those with good insight can see forms." So I see this passage as having a very, very deep significance. So first, it indicates the first line of praise, turning upright what was overthrown. Like our minds are usually, we would say, from the standpoint of the Buddha, the ordinary human mind is upside down and inside out. Like we don't understand things correctly, but we understand things and view things through certain distorting lenses. Or what happens is the mind constructs mental constructions and then projects them out into the world. And so we see things in terms of our mental projections. So we're seeing things not as they are, but upside down and inside out. And so when the Buddha teaches the Dhamma has the function of turning upright what was upside down. So our way of seeing things and understanding things now becomes corrected as our wisdom or insight arises. Then we come to see things correctly rather than in these distorted ways. Again, the second phrase says that he reveals what was hidden. And what he is revealing is, as we'll see as we go on in the course, is the truth about our own life, the truth about our own nature, about our own existence. And our own existence, our own experience is closest to us, closer than anything else, since we are the actual experiencer. But the nature of our experience, the nature of our existence, is hidden from us, the real nature. And so the task of the Buddha is to reveal what was hidden, not as a divine revelation, but by explaining, clarifying, proclaiming, illustrating the nature of human existence. Okay, the third phrase says that he shows the way to one who is lost. And so in our ordinary lives, what we are basically seeking is happiness and freedom from suffering. And yet, because our minds are upside down and inside out, we tend to seek happiness, contentment, peace in the wrong places, along the wrong way. And so the task, in a sense, we're like people who are lost. We're looking for a particular place. Maybe we've come the first time to New York City, and we're looking for Brooklyn, and we don't know a particular place in Brooklyn. We don't know how to find Brooklyn. And so we take maybe our train takes us to Grand Central Station, and we go to the subway, and then we take the first train that comes along, going uptown to the Bronx. And so in a sense, the Buddha is the one who guides us to the subway map, or tells us which train to take to get to Brooklyn. And then the fourth phrase says that his teaching of the Dhamma, it's holding up a lamp in the darkness so that those with good eyesight can see forms. So in our ordinary life, we have that potential for wisdom, that is good eyesight, but most of the time we're moving about in a kind of spiritual darkness. And so the Buddha holds up the lamp. This is the lamp of the Dharma, so that we could use our potential wisdom, guided by the Dhamma, to see things as they really are. Just like a man in the dark room, when somebody brings a lamp into the dark room, then he can see visible forms. Okay, then I took another passage, again, which shows the function of the Buddha. Okay, so here we have the text says that whether Buddhas arise in the world or not, there persists that law, that stable principle. That stable principle is the Dhamma, that fixed nature of the Dhamma, and that is that all conditioned things are impermanent. I don't want to dwell on this principle right now of impermanence. That's one of the truths that the Buddha discovers. But what I want to focus on is the function of the Buddha. Here it says that a Buddha awakens to this and realizes it. So that's the first task of the Buddha, is to awaken to discover, to realize the nature of things. And then the second task is to explain the nature of things. So he explains it, proclaims it, analyzes it, elucidates it, and teaches that all conditioned things are impermanent, and so forth. Okay, so in the Dhamma itself, we actually have two aspects. One is principles. So these are the truths or principles that the Buddha discovers and makes known. And these are not like divine revelations or divine or sacred dogmas that have to be believed and accepted out of trust or out of faith. But these are the principles that the Buddha has discovered through his enlightenment, and that are potentially available for anybody who follows his path to penetrate and to realize for themselves. Okay, so one aspect is that of principles. The other aspect is that of practices. So the Buddha lays special emphasis on undertaking the practices that will lead to benefits for oneself and for others. And so we have one statement, it's the very concise statement about, in a sense, the essence of Buddhist practices. This comes in a verse in a work called the Dhammapada. It's a collection of versified sayings of the Buddha, that not to do any evil, to cultivate the good, and to purify one's own mind. This is the instruction of the Buddhas. And so here we have actually the Buddha's whole training, in a sense, included within this short verse. So not to do any evil, like that is the starting point. And in other teachings, the Buddha will enumerate, sometimes in a lot of detail, the various kinds of evil or unwholesome deeds one might commit that have to be avoided. Then the second aspect is to cultivate the good, to cultivate good qualities and good actions that are the opposite of the evil actions. And then what's distinctive, so we could say that these two principles or practices, avoiding evil, cultivating the good, this is the aspect of morality or ethics, ethical behavior. And then purifying one's own mind refers especially to the practice of meditation. So we say the practice of meditation is the way to purify the mind. In a broader way, the practices the practice of the Buddha's teaching is often laid out in terms of three types of training. So there is training in moral conduct. And here, in terms of this verse, that would comprise both the aspect of avoiding evil or bad actions and cultivating the good, engaging in various types of good or wholesome actions. Then the purifying of the mind, the initial stage is undertaken through the practice of meditation. Through the practice of meditation, we're developing qualities like mindfulness and mental clarity, calmness, and collecting the mind. Usually the mind is scattered and distracted, so we're training to collect and unify the mind. And then the third stage of Buddhist practice is the development of wisdom. So even meditation for Buddhism is not sufficient. Sometimes people think when they hear about Buddhism, they think Buddhism is completely entirely comprised within the practice of meditation. But in fact, the practice of Buddhism takes place in terms of these three aspects of training. At the very foundation is to lead an ethical life by observing the principles of right conduct. And then on the basis of right conduct, then one cultivates the mind in order to purify the distracting and disturbing thoughts, the disturbing, tumultuous tendencies of the mind. And then when the mind becomes calm, clear, and collected, then one could use that concentrated mind in order to investigate the nature of one's own experience. And that is the means for the development, for the arising of wisdom. Okay, I've selected some text that will help us to understand some different aspects of the nature of the Buddha's teaching. And one aspect, which I alluded to before, is that it doesn't demand that one place blind belief in the teaching. There are certain principles that the Buddha teaches which are beyond the capacity of ordinary people to see for themselves. But the Buddha begins with things that we can observe for ourselves and see for ourselves and verify for ourselves. And one excellent example of this comes in a discourse that the Buddha gave to a group of people who were living in a certain town called Kesaputta. These people, their clan name was the Kalamas. And it's said that a number of spiritual teachers with different beliefs, different doctrines had come to this town, and they had taught the people their own doctrines, promoting and praising their own doctrines, and tearing down the views of their opponents. And so the Kalamas, when the Buddha arrived in their town, the Kalamas came to him, and they said that they are perplexed and doubt about which of these teachers is speaking truth and which are speaking falsehood. Now these people, the Kalamas, they were not disciples of the Buddha. They were just, it was just the Buddha would go traveling from town to town and village to village, giving his teachings. And so when the Kalamas heard that the Buddha came, they knew that the Buddha had a good reputation. And so they came to him to ask for him to clarify the conflicting teachings of the other teachers. But in this situation, the Buddha didn't say, forget about the teachings of the others. I'm going to tell you the truth. You follow my teaching. But instead, if you could see, he says that it's fitting for you to be perplexed. It's fitting for you to be in doubt. Doubt has arisen about a perplexing matter. And then he said to the Kalamas, do not go by oral tradition, what's been passed down through one generation of teachers to another. Don't depend upon a lineage of teaching, by hearsay, by a collection of texts, by logic and inferential reasoning. Don't believe a teacher just because he's very eloquent, and very impressive. And don't even believe somebody just because you think that he is your teacher. The Buddha then says, when you know for yourselves these things are unwholesome, these things are blamable, these things are blamed by the wise, these things, if followed up, lead to harm and suffering, then you should abandon them. And then he used a common sense way of questioning. So he asked the Kalamas, what do you think when greed, hatred, and delusion arise in you? Does it lead to your welfare or to your harm? They say it leads to harm. Then the Buddha said, a person who is greedy, hating, and deluded, overpowered by greed, hatred, and delusion, motivated by these mental forces, will destroy life, steal the belongings of others, commit sexual misconduct, speak lies, and will also persuade others to act in the same way. So will that lead to his harm and suffering for a long time? And the answer is yes. And so, through argumentation or questioning, the Buddha gets the Kalamas, the people, to see that these things, greed, hatred, delusion, and the actions that flow from them are unwholesome, they're unethical, they're blameworthy, they're criticized by the wise, and if one acts upon them, they'll lead to one's harm and suffering. And then in the opposite way, the Buddha speaks about a person who is without greed, hatred, and delusion, So when the mind is free from greed, hatred, and delusion, does it lead to one's well-being or to one's harm? It leads to one's well-being. And a person without greed, hatred, and delusion will avoid taking life, stealing, sexual misconduct, and false speech, and persuade others to do likewise. And that will lead to their welfare and happiness for a long time. Okay, so from this we could see that the Buddha here is appealing to something that one could see and verify for oneself. And in a way, this is like the essence of his teaching, is to overcome and to eliminate greed, hatred, and delusion. These are what the Buddha calls the three unwholesome roots. They're the roots of all the other disturbing and distressing mental states. All arise and are rooted in greed, hatred, and delusion. And greed, hatred, and delusion, those are the underlying motives for all types of unwholesome action. And so the ultimate aim of the Buddha's teaching is to overcome and actually to eradicate, to eliminate greed, hatred, and delusion. Because those things, we could see, lead to unwholesome behavior. They bring harm to oneself, harm to others. And here, like without appealing to any kind of unverifiable doctrine, the Buddha just appeals to what you could see for yourself just by personal investigation. Of course, the Kalamas must have been rather intelligent people to understand, to understand this rather easily, since maybe nowadays if you go to certain groups of people and you say, is greed good or bad? They'll say, greed is good. And if somebody does commit some wrong to you, should you have hatred towards them or endure it patiently? And they'll say, it's okay to have hatred towards them and to commit violence against them. But if one reflects on the ultimate consequences of acting on greed and hatred, one could see that that is harmful. Okay, I took another sutta here, another discourse, in which the Buddha is in conversation with a young Brahmin. This young Brahmin has been challenging the Buddha, and then the Buddha replied to this young Brahmin until the young Brahmin became interested in the Buddha's teaching. And then the young Brahmin asked the Buddha how the discovery of truth takes place. And this is a very important aspect of the Buddha's teaching, because in Buddhism, the truth is something that we're supposed to realize for ourselves. The ultimate liberation for Buddhism, it doesn't come simply from believing the Buddha and accepting that the Buddha, you are the enlightened one, your teaching is true and wonderful and magnificent, but the truth is something that one has to realize for oneself. And so here, this young Brahmin asked the Buddha, how does this discovery of truth take place? And then the Buddha answers, he says, first, a seeker should go to somebody who's reputed to be a teacher and investigate that teacher, to observe his conduct, his way of life, his manner, his way of speaking, his teaching. And when he sees that the teacher's conduct is very virtuous and that the teacher shows good personal qualities and teaches in a very humble and honest way, then he gains faith in that teacher. He visits him and pays respect to him. Then after paying respect to him, because respect is important for opening the mind to receive spiritual teachings, then one listens to that teacher. And when one listens, then one hears the Dhamma, the teaching of that teacher. then having heard the Dhamma, one retains it in mind and one examines the meaning of the teachings. You see, one is here progressing. Initially, one places faith or trust in the teacher, which doesn't mean that one surrenders blindly to the teacher, but it just means that one is willing to trust the teacher and open one's mind to that teacher's teaching. But when one hears the teaching, then one has to examine the meaning of those teachings, to investigate and see whether they can stand up under investigation. Okay, then when one examines the meaning of the teachings, then one is willing to accept those teachings as a result of that examination. Okay, then when one accepts the teachings, then there arises a desire to realize the truth. And when that desire arises, then one applies the will. Having applied the will, again one investigates the teaching, now at a deeper level. Then having examined the teaching, one strives, and then by striving, this would apply to the development of deep insight meditation, then one personally realizes the supreme truth and sees it by penetrating it with wisdom. In this way, there is the discovery of truth. Okay, now when we speak about the discovery of truth, or the realization of truth, the Buddha is not speaking about like realizing objective facts about the world, the kind of facts that are given to us, by the physical sciences or biological sciences. That kind of information you can get if you want to learn that truth about the world. You take courses in physics, biology, chemistry. But the truth that the Buddha is teaching is the truth about human existence. Particularly those truths that will enable us to liberate ourselves from suffering. And so for this reason, the Buddha rejects as irrelevant. During the Buddha's time, there was a lot of discussion amongst the philosophers and religious teachers about various abstract philosophical questions. And the Buddha rejected, he refused to state any position on those speculative questions. And one time the Buddha had a monk disciple named Malankya-Putta who came to the Buddha and he said, all of the other spiritual teachers have been presenting their views about these philosophical questions, but you haven't said anything about them. And I'm not happy with that. You have to tell me what is your position on those questions. And if you don't tell me, I'm going to take off my robe and leave you. Then the Buddha replied to that monk with a very famous simile. It's the simile of the poisoned arrow. So he says, if anyone should say that I won't lead the spiritual life under the Blessed One, under the Buddha, until the Buddha tells me whether the world is eternal or not eternal, finite or infinite, whether the soul is the same as the body or different from the body, whether the enlightened one exists after death or doesn't exist after death, I'm not going to answer those questions. And that person would die before they get an answer from me. And then the Buddha he illustrates this with a simile. He gives a simile of a man who's been wounded by a poisoned arrow. And then his friends and relatives, they bring a surgeon to cure the man, to treat the man. take out the arrow. And so when the surgeon comes, then the wounded man says, I won't let the surgeon pull out this arrow until I know the name and clan of the man who wounded me, until I know whether that man was tall, short, of middle height, whether he had a dark brown or golden skin complexion, until I know what material the bow and arrow were made from, and so forth. So if the man were to act like that, refusing to let the surgeon pull out the arrow, he would die. And so, the Buddha says, if anyone says, I won't lead the spiritual life under the Buddha until he answers those questions, I still won't answer those questions, and meanwhile that person would die. And then the Buddha said that he doesn't declare answers to those questions because the answers are unbeneficial, they don't relate to the spiritual life, they don't lead to enlightenment and to liberation. And what the Buddha teaches, this is what he says. He teaches the nature of suffering, the origin or cause of suffering, liberation from suffering, and the way to liberation from suffering.
I was alone in the forest, meditating. At nightfall, my only company was the flickering light from a kerosene lamp that someone gave. Though little it may be, that light gave me strength to keep on striving. It taught me to remember the kindness of others, no matter how simple or how small the acts appear to be.
It's a gift we must always remember. Its flame burns to comfort lost feeling. Its flame burns to comfort lost feeling. Alive in the dark. sharing with others.
When you observe the 5 precepts, as you did just now, we must understand why you observe the 5 precepts. It is important to understand that most people who observe the 5 precepts, they only recite the 5 precepts when they come to the temple. But when they go home, they might be quarreling with the neighbors, or maybe quarreling with between husband and wife, or maybe quarreling with the children, and all kinds of things are happening. Why is this? That means it is so difficult to practice the 5 precepts. There is a reason for this. The reason is that our minds are narrow. When the mind is narrow, we are thinking mainly about ourselves. So if we are mainly concerned about ourselves, we are not very much concerned about other people. That is a narrow mind. This is why some people believe that the 5 precepts are based on a belief in karma and rebirth. Now, if the 5 precepts are based on karma and rebirth, what is karma and rebirth doing? Karma and rebirth is punishing and rewarding people. So if we practice the 5 precepts based on karma and rebirth, that is a selfish kind of morality. That selfish kind of morality is for immature people and for animals. But the teaching of the Buddha is not based on karma and rebirth. It is very important to understand that. The teaching of the Buddha is based on what is called metta. Metta is the Pali word. The Sanskrit word is Maitri. And that word means universal goodwill or universal benevolence or a universal interest in the welfare of all beings, a concern about the welfare of all beings. That means it is a broad mind, not a narrow mind. So the 5 precepts are practiced not to avoid punishment or to gain rewards. The 5 precepts are practiced because we are concerned about the welfare of others. The 5 precepts are mainly concerned about how we relate to other people. The first precept is about not harming anyone. Second precept is about not stealing. Third precept is about not committing adultery. And the fourth precept is about controlling our speech, which hurts other people. And the fifth precept is about taking intoxicants or being carried away by our emotions, so that we begin to hurt others. So we are trying to avoid that. So all that is based on how we relate to other people. It is based on a concern for the welfare of all beings, not only thinking about ourselves. It is based on a broad mind. That breadth of mind is what is called metta or maitri. This is why I call it universal benevolence or universal goodwill. We cannot have metta for one person. This is why it is not just love. Love is something that you can have for just one person. But metta is for all beings. You cannot have metta even for the people of your own country. Patriotism is not metta. Metta cannot be only for human beings with no compassion for animals. That is not metta. Metta is for all beings. It is a concern for the welfare of all beings. That is the broad mind, where we think of all beings. It is very important to understand this, because the morality or ethics of the teachings of the Buddha is based on a broad mind. And when we cultivate metta, we are cultivating a broad mind. And when we cultivate metta, metta turns into karuna. Karuna is not another kind of thought or a different kind of mental state. Karuna is an expansion of metta. Metta grows into karuna. When we practice metta, metta grows into karuna. Then what is karuna? Karuna is where we don't distinguish between ourselves and others. That others are as important as ourselves. So metta is like the depth dimension. No, I'm sorry. Karuna is like the depth dimension. Metta is like the length and breadth, the area dimension. When we talk about volume, we are talking about length, breadth and height. These are three dimensions. So karuna is the third dimension. Metta is two-dimensional, like area dimension. We are spreading out to include all beings in the universe. And karuna is how deeply are we interested in the welfare of all beings. just as a mother thinks of her only child, and is even willing to sacrifice her own life for the sake of this child. In the same way, we begin to become concerned about the welfare of all beings, and we lose our selfishness. In Karuna, the selfishness disappears. Just like a river falling into the ocean and loses its identity. It becomes the water of the ocean. The river is no more. In the same way, when Karuna appears, the self disappears. And that disappearance of self means all unhappiness disappears. Because all unhappiness is self-centered. I don't have this, I don't have that. I feel like this, I hate this. That kind of thinking is the unhappiness, the suffering. When that self-centered thinking disappears, there is no unhappiness anymore. You become happy as a result. That happiness of selflessness is called mudita. So mudita is happiness, but not self-centered happiness. It is the happiness of selflessness. This is why, although the Buddha was aware of the sufferings of all beings, he was never unhappy. He was happy all the time. Otherwise, he should have been crying all the time, because he saw the unhappiness of all beings. Although he was aware of the sufferings of all beings, he was happy. That happiness was the happiness of selflessness. That is mudita. Now that mudita or happiness is not an emotional excitement. Mudita is not an emotional excitement. Even metta is not an emotional excitement. And karuna is not an emotional excitement. And mudita is not an emotional excitement. It is a very calm, tranquil state of the mind. So you see, metta, karuna, mudita, and these are not different states of the mind. It is the same state, seen from different angles. Just as we can take a picture of this hall with a camera, we can turn the camera in different directions and take the pictures, and every picture will be different. But we are all taking a picture of the room. So in the same way, when we speak of metta, karuna, mudita, and upekkha, we are looking at the same state of mind from different angles. And what is upekkha? When the mind is calm and tranquil, the mind is not centered on what is going on outside. Whatever is going on outside does not disturb the mind. Gain and loss, fame and ill fame, praise and blame, pleasure and pain. These are the 8 vicissitudes of life. The changing vicissitudes of life. When these vicissitudes change, the mind is not disturbed, because the mind is focused within, not outside. That is the perfect tranquility of mind. That perfect tranquility of mind means the mind is focused within, not looking for pleasure outside, not looking for happiness outside. That is the meaning of upekkha. Upa ikkate. Upa means inside. Apa means outside. The mind is not focused on the outside. The mind is focused on the inside. And when the mind is focused on the inside, what does the mind see? The mind does not see a self there. Normally, when the mind is focused inside, we begin to see a self. Why do we see a self? Because every experience contains two factors. An experience is either seeing with our eyes, or hearing with our ears, or smelling with our nose, or tasting with our tongue, or touching with our body. These are the experiences. And in every experience, there are two parts. One we call the objective part. The other we call the subjective part. The objective and the subjective. The objective is what we see. If we think of seeing, what we see is the object. The subjective is the process of seeing. The process of seeing we personalize and say, this seeing is mine. The moment we personalize the seeing, that seeing becomes myself. I see. I am seeing. I am seeing the object which is outside. I see a rat, or I see a wall, or I see a table, or I see a chair. So the seeing part is mine, and the object seeing is something outside. So we personalize the subjective part of the experience, and we alienate the objective part. So it is by personalizing the subjective part that we create a self. The self is created through personalization of the subjective. But when we are able to observe this happening, we begin to see that the self and the world outside are just a creation of our mind. We are creating the world and we are creating the self that lives in the world. And when we begin to understand this properly, a paradigm shift occurs. A paradigm shift means we begin to see things in a different way. There are two ways of looking at the same experience. I call it the existential way of looking and the experiential way of looking. Existential way of looking means that we are thinking of a subjective existence and an objective existence. The subjective existence is myself. I exist. And the objective existence is whatever is in the world outside. The objective existence. And when we think of this existence, there occurs a relationship. A relationship between the subject and the object. The I and what is in the world. That relationship is an emotional relationship. The emotional relationship comes in the form of a desire or a hatred or a fear or a worry. That is how suffering comes into being. Suffering is simply the emotional relationship. It is a disturbance of the mind as well as the body. That disturbance is the suffering. And that disturbance occurred because we created an existence of a subject and an object. And the existence is created by the emotional reaction that personalizes the subjective and alienates the objective. So, this way, we are producing suffering automatically by the way we think. So it is by becoming aware of this properly that the paradigm shift occurs, where we begin to give up the existential way of thinking and we observe the experiential way of thinking, where we begin to become aware of this experience that is going on automatically due to the presence of the necessary conditions. And that full awareness of this process of perception is the attainment of what is called nirvana. Nirvana means the imperturbable serenity of mind. The mind that can never be disturbed. Of course, to understand this fully, we have to achieve a certain degree of calmness and tranquility of mind. It is only with that tranquility of mind that this can be seen properly, and to achieve that state of tranquility, we must be able to broaden our mind and think of all beings. It starts with controlling our behavior, which is called sila. And the sila is achieved by taking refuge in the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha. The Buddha is the one who reached that state of perfection. And Dhamma is that teaching of the Buddha that shows the way to that state of perfection. And Sangha means the followers of this teaching of the Buddha, who carry the teachings into the world and into the future from generation to generation. So by taking refuge in the Buddha, Dhamma and the Sangha, we begin to practice the Sila, which starts with the 5 precepts and ends up with purity of mind or tranquility of mind by broadening the mind. And by broadening the mind, we begin to become aware of the experience. And by becoming aware of the experience, as an experience, as an impersonal experience, which is brought about by the presence of the necessary conditions. As everything in the world, everything that happens in the world happens only due to the presence of the necessary conditions. They are all impersonal happenings. There is no person involved. When this is properly understood, we gain freedom from all sufferings. And that is the ultimate attainment of the imperturbable serenity of mind. So I hope you understood